Black Friday deals. You're going to be shopping with me. I'm going to be pointing out my perspective on M3, even M2, and even down to M1, if you should possibly buy one of those on sale instead of the latest M4 Pro or M4 Max. Now, when you are shopping, make sure you know what you're looking for. A lot of times prices can look good, but the specifications and the equipment that the deal comes with aren't actually what you had needed because you just saw a price, you saw some configuration, you're like, oh, that's a good deal, I'm gonna grab it. So the reason I'm making this video is A, to point out deals, but also talk through the logic in making the right purchasing decision for your needs. Now, as we're going through the video, if you're curious about the exact pricing and availability, I have links in the description below. This is a little preview doc of all the links in the description below, and I'll add links as we go through this live stream and we have comments and interactions and engagement, and as people ask questions and I help them make a decision, I'll add links as well so we can contextualize all the information you'll have here in this video. But I'm super stoked to be on with you guys for these Black Friday deals. Now, first and foremost, I want to start off with probably the most important recommendation that I could feel like I could personally make based on my workflow, and that's talking about the MacBook Air 15-inch, which is one of my favorite laptops. I use it almost every day, and the release of the M4 Pro, M4 chipset, which also comes in M4, M4 Pro, and M4 Max. So I've had a lot of people asking me, hey, should I buy the 14-inch MacBook Pro with the base model M4 chip? And my recommendation is pretty much no. And I'm going to walk you through why. I'm going to walk you through what decision I would be making if I was looking to buy a new MacBook right now. So if you look at the M4 chipset, okay, the price is $15.99 for 16 gigs of RAM, 512 gigs of storage, and this is the 14-inch model. Okay, for $100 less, you could get the 15-inch MacBook Air with the M3 for 16 gigs of RAM, 512 gig SSD. However, if you want to go ahead and upgrade that to 24 gigs of RAM for just a mere $100 more, you're getting more RAM, which for most people, more RAM is actually going to make a bigger difference in their daily workflow than having the slightly higher new M4 chip. More RAM will do more because a lot of us are not doing heavy intensive work all day long. We're mostly doing a lot of multitasking, and multitasking benefits when you have more RAM. And so that's where I would say, if I was going to put my money on something, I would do a MacBook Air 15-inch M3 with 24 gigs of RAM, which only puts me at $100 more than the MacBook Pro 14 with the new M4 chip. Now, with that in mind, if you're somebody who's doing 6K video editing, if you're somebody who's doing, working in DaVinci Resolve and doing super complex video editing, then it would make sense to get a new M4 chip. But I would not get the base M4. I would get something like an M4 Pro or an M4 Max. But the craziest part about that is those chips always come with more RAM. And RAM is often a big determination of the performance you're going to see. Not only do you have more cores and threads, but you have more RAM, which programs like RAM, especially while multitasking. So I just want you to think critically about the laptop you're choosing. Don't always think that light gets so bright after filming for hours in the studio. Don't always think that because you're getting the newest chip, that's what's making the performance difference. If you have been looking at the newest release, all these MacBook series, their base models have now become the 16 gigs, which makes everything increase in performance. So just wanted to point that out before we dove into the video. If you're just getting into here, links are in the description below. You can go ahead and grab any of those links, check the live pricing, make a purchase. If you do, I'll get a small commission, but at no extra cost to you. But that's what keeps this channel alive and the helpful content coming your way. We got a question real quick from the doctor. Hey, I got the MacBook Pro M4 with 512 gig storage. Do you think I should make a return to get the M4 with 1 terabyte? Now, if it were me, I don't necessarily think 512 versus 1 terabyte is the end of the world. I always have drives that I carry along with me. I'll see if I can reach up here and grab one real quick. So I always carry along Kingston XS 1000 and XS 2000s. And so I've never actually filled up my MacBook Air 15 with 512 gigs of storage. I would say that if you were sitting at a 256 gig storage, then absolutely I would return it and upgrade. 512, it can get you by. It's gotten me by for the past 2 years that I've had this. Now, if I were to, go back and make a future purchase, if I were to go back and now make a purchase, I would maybe consider 1 terabyte, but it's an additional $100+ to add that terabyte. So for me, RAM is way more important than storage. I will make a decision off of RAM way more when it comes to these Apple products than I will ever make a decision based on storage. Funny question. If you are stuck with one laptop brand for the rest of your life, which one would you choose? If I was stuck and I could only buy one laptop brand, and I needed to be able to run any product, any software, any application, and not be limited by my system, most applications are x86. And so I would probably buy a Lenovo Legion Pro 5i. However, if it was not based on applications and software, and the laptop theoretically could run any software, any product, anytime, I would probably choose my MacBook Air, but that's not the case. There's so many softwares, like for instance, I use something called vMix to run these live streams. I can't use this software on an Apple device. And so for me, I can't use an Apple. I would have to use a Windows-based device. So it really comes down to use case a lot of times. A lot of 3D modelers and architects, they can't utilize programs on Apple devices. They have to use an x86 Windows device. So that's kind of like a long way around of how I would make that decision. So yep, that's that. Okay, let's go ahead and Boogie, whatever you want to say, Boogie all the way back into here to the M1 lineup. Okay, so looking at the M1 lineup, I know a lot of people have been asking, should you go back and get on Amazon and buy a renewed 2020 M1 chip? And there's some validity to this idea, for sure. One of the big things to consider when going all the way back to the M1 is the value. These devices are still incredible performers on the world stage when you compare them up against like the 2024 Windows thin and light laptops. These still compete with 2024 Windows laptops and sometimes actually beat them. But you want to make sure you're making the right purchase at the right price point. And so for me, at 16 gigs of RAM on a MacBook Pro M1 with a 1 terabyte of storage at $800, that's a pretty good price for that laptop. However, if I go and check out, let me pull up the equivalent that I was looking at here. If I go and I pull up the Air, the MacBook Air at M1, 16 gigs of RAM, 512 gigs of storage, that's $700. Okay, now I'm going to go and I'm going to pull up a MacBook Air with an M2, and this is a brand new laptop. It's $749. It has 16 gigs of RAM, but it has a 256 gig storage. And so that's where the M1 Air with 512 and 16 gigs of RAM is a bit advantageous. You get that extra, bit of storage, but you do have a, a generation older. And so these are kind of those individual personal choices that you have to make. And you've got to kind of piece together the puzzle if you're looking for the best bang for buck. Personally, I'm rocking an M2 MacBook Air 15-inch. If I were to go back and buy this again, I would get 16 gigs of RAM and I would get a 1 terabyte SSD. I have 8 gigs of RAM and a 512 in the system that I have before me. Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll just search for that real quick. So MacBook Air 15, 16 gigs, 1 terabyte. Let's see what that pulls up. 1 terabyte. Because I want to do kind of some live problem solving with y'all here. So see if we can find, okay, 15-inch, here we go. So this is $1,399, okay? Now the question is this a good deal? $1,399, M2, 16 gigs, 1 terabyte. I'd like to make that purchase. But let's go ahead and check out M3. So if we can find a 15-inch M3, 16, 1 terabyte. So far we only have 512. See, this is hard to shop around on for Best Buy because they have like specific configurations. Okay, 13, 15. Okay, so, or you can get the M3, 15, 16 here. Okay, so here's the price difference here. We have an M3 with 512 at $1,234 versus the M2 with 1 terabyte. Okay, so the M2 would cost more money right now, but you get an additional terabyte of storage. So it's $150 more to get an older chip, but more storage. What's important to you? For me, I would be okay getting the M3 with a little bit less storage and just buying a drive because I'm actually going to save money. And I don't need to like go out and buy a drive tomorrow. Like I can save $170 today and then get the drive another time. So this is where like, man, the pricing is weird right now because they still have so many models available from Apple. You really have to price compare to make sure you're making the right decision for your needs. Okay, now remember in the description below, like I said, if you're just joining, you have all the links for the products that I'm looking at here. If you make a purchase, I'll get a small commission, but at no extra cost to you. But of course, that's what keeps this channel alive and the helpful content coming your way. So this all started because we're discussing if the M1s are a good buy. And contextually, they can be. For instance, I think that this Apple MacBook Pro M1 Pro with 16 gigs of RAM and 1 terabyte for $800, because it has the 16 RAM and the 1 terabyte, it could be a good buy for somebody, especially if you're not doing advanced like 6K video editing. But I think that it's 4 generations old now. It's leaning towards being a little overpriced. And the old 13-inch MacBook Pros, to me, are now the new MacBook Air 13 M1, the new MacBook Air 13 and the new MacBook Air 15. That's what's replaced these MacBook Pro M1s. And as you just saw, let me pull up a MacBook Air 13. It's got to be around here somewhere. There we go. As you just saw, $749 for what would be a 2020, oh no, not that one. Sorry. There it is. So a 2023 MacBook Air 13 is kind of the equivalent of a MacBook Pro M1 13. But let's find it with 16 gigs of RAM. So MacBook Air 13, 16 GB, M3. So this is where we can really kind of compare punch for punch prices and see if it truly, valuable or not. So there we go. There's kind of the modern day MacBook Pro, $1,049. Or you can get it with 256, which again, that's a bit of a risk because you got really low storage and that burns up pretty quickly. So we have a $1,049 or we have $849 versus the $800 on the original MacBook Pro. But you get a terabyte of storage. So this is where you really have to do digging. Like I'm saying, I would not choose the M3 with 256. I would more go for the MacBook Air 13 M3, 16 gigs of RAM, 512. But that puts you at the $1,049 price point. So it can get rather expensive rather quickly. So this is my thought on like the more budget end side of things. Now, as we move up, let's go ahead and talk about Apple MacBook Pro 14. But before we do, I want to go ahead and answer a few questions here. Apple fanboys ain't got no money for that super expensive storage. Got to use much slower external drives. But then what's the point of having fast internal storage if you can't use it by only having 512? That's a really good point. See, and that's where you have to be really considerate on your workflow. I edit off of these. They're fast. I've never run into an issue editing off of one of these and saying, oh, like it's too slow. It's fairly quick. And I am definitely not an Apple fanboy. I push anything that gives the performance that I need. For me, when I use Apple, I'm using Apple for the ecosystem, the simplicity, the battery life. And that is something that often is much better than its Windows counterpart. And so for me, that's where I'm looking at making a purchasing decision is, do I get on-the-go battery life? Can I edit the footage I need? And so that's where the Apple makes sense for my on-the-go life. And so that's something to consider is, do you need to be able to edit on the go with this all the time? Is this your main workstation? Then that's where a terabyte of storage would make sense and the extra expense would make sense. Where's the best store your data files? I don't want to use iCloud or SSD. Then I would just do some research on the best cloud storage, the most reliable cloud storage. That's what I would do. Okay, Pilot R4. What would you recommend to get for an engineering major 3D modeling at the sub $1,200 mark? Well, R4, it depends on what software you're using, because you have to first of all consider, is the software that you want to use available on Mac OS, on Apple Silicon? If it's not, then you're going to have to lean towards a Windows laptop. So I always encourage people to think of the software they're going to use first and then work their way backwards to the device they want to use. So Pilot R4, if you tell me the software you're going to use and let me know if it's compatible with Apple, that's really the first place I have people start. Okay, now let's jump back into Apple M4 Pro. I push people towards M4 Pro and M4 Max once they're getting into higher resolution video editing or more complex 4K video editing or motion design or programs that are available for 3D modeling. I don't think people really have to enter the Pro or the Max chip until they're moving above just intermediate 4K video editing. Like I said, I edit 6K B-RAW footage on this 8 gig MacBook Air 15 with a 512 SSD. And it does the job for me. Now, I'm not constantly doing that. It's usually my on-the-go editing, but it has the performance I need. And so when I say I can confidently recommend a 15-inch MacBook Air with an M3 chip at 16 gigs of RAM with a 512 SSD, I'm very serious about that because it's a use case I use on a daily basis. Now, with my 8 gigs, it bottlenecks, which is why I recommend the 16 gigs or above for the MacBook Air 15, because if you don't want this thing to bottleneck, which it does have a tendency to do for me, don't make my same mistake and buy 8 gigs. I was just being very frugal when I bought mine, and that is why it happened to me. Mac is a no-go for 3D modeling, especially for $1,200. I agree with Thinline Media on that. If you're going to put $1,200 into a laptop for 3D modeling, I will show you, and unfortunately it's above $1,200, but I'll show you what I would purchase personally. If you want to be around $1,200, Lenovo Legion Slim 516. This is what I would personally buy if you wanted to be around the $1,200 price point. You're going to have an upgradable laptop. It's going to start at 16 gigs of RAM, but that can be upgraded to 32 or 64 when your budget allows. You're going to have an RTX 4070 and that Ryzen 7735HS. The processor will be plenty, most likely for your needs. You really want to focus on improving your RAM and having a nice dedicated GPU. So that would be my recommendation. Top 3 programs I'd probably use are Blender, Rivet, and AutoCAD. So this is my recommendation for that kind of sub laptop. Because the problem is, if your budget's $1,200 for Apple, let's see here. I mean, you're going to be sitting at, an M3 or an M2 with not a lot of performance. And so that's kind of the problem, is you don't even have the GPU cores and like the robust abilities of the M4 Pro or even the M3 Pro or M3 Max or M4 Max. You're just stuck at kind of that basic chipset. And so that is kind of, you're going to just be disappointed in the system at that low of a budget. So I hope that doesn't discourage you, but there are a lot of great options in different gaming laptops to have the performance you need for 3D modeling. So that's my feedback on 3D modeling. It's still, the world is still ruled by x86 in regards to 3D modeling. Okay, so again, I think that the M4 Pro is plenty of performance, and it puts you in at around $17.99 for like 4K, 6K video editing. When I see people moving up to something like the M3 Max or M4 Max, this is the next conversation I want to have. So if you look at the price on the M3 Max versus, say, something like the M4 Max, both have exact same savings. And so for me, it's like, do you really need all the performance of the latest and greatest chip? Because if you go back and you watch when M3 Max launched, of course, everybody said it was the greatest thing ever. It was so fast. Don't listen to that it's better. Like, I think that's the biggest problem. People always say, oh, the M4 Max is better. Well, better than what and for what purpose? So if you look at the M3 Max, you can get it for $27.99. The M4 Max, you can get for $28.99. So contextually, the M4 Max is the better deal. It's the newer chip, blah, blah, blah. However, if your savings, let's go over here to the 16-inch M4 Max, is $36.99, and the 16-inch M3 Max is $33.99, you have a wider margin in savings. So you save about $300 versus the $100. And so these are kind of those budgeting decisions you have to make. Now, let's go even further and go to the M2 Max. At the M2 Max, you're saving almost $1,000. Okay, so with that in mind, what I would recommend doing is going and looking at benchmarks for what your use case is. Okay, let's say your use case is 4K video editing. So for me, I have videos on my channel with 4K video editing. I do everything with a 9-minute export time out of Premiere Pro, and I export that, and you can see how long it took to export or how many drop frames it had, right? There's other channels that have done similar benchmarks that you might need. And I would go back, maybe their video is 2 or 3 years old by this time because it's the M2 Max. Watch the export time. Watch the rendering, how fast it renders certain files in, say, AutoCAD or whatever it might be you're using. I don't even know if AutoCAD is, off the top of my head, if that's a Mac OS native software. Anyway, maybe the M2 Max has all the performance that you need. Then the M2 Max would be the right pick for you. The latest and greatest is only as good as your use case. I don't have a use case personally for an M4 Max 16-inch device with 48 gigs of RAM at $3,700. I don't have a use case for that because I have a desktop PC that I run all of my system on. It would be $2,000 of wasted money because what I should be buying, as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, at $16.99 instead of $36.99, is a MacBook Air 15 with 24 gigs of RAM and a 512 SSD. That's the perfect laptop for me because I have a desktop system and I just use this MacBook Air on the go for live streams, for editing when I'm out of town, etc. So again, I really want this video to be, here's all the deals and here's where they're at and here's the different comparisons, and help you make the right buying decision. So that's really like my whole thought of like M4 Pro all the way up to M4 Max, and then looking back a few generations to say M2 Max. And I would say right now, the best bang for buck is probably going to be the M2 Max because it's going to save you $1,000 off of the M4 Max. Now, 48 gigs of RAM versus 32. And I think you have 1 terabyte of storage, which you have 1 terabyte of storage. Still a beast machine. So there are some considerations there with considering all the different generations of Apple silicone. And I hope if you're watching this video and you were just looking for deals, that you think about how to get the best deal for yourself, not which laptop is on sale the most. That's really my hope for this video. I risk it being a, somewhat maybe not boring video, but just not as exciting. Like, oh my gosh, Ben found the M4 Max for $1,000 off. No, the sales are not that great, even throughout the past 2 generations as we're seeing right now. But what would be great is if the M2 Max worked for your use cases, and then you could save a lot of money. Okay, next we're looking at the Mac Mini, and we have the M4, and then we have the M4 Pro. I think the sweet spot for the Mac Mini, because if you're not getting the Mac Mini and you need a ton of performance, in the Mac Studio usually makes the most sense for people, I would say would be the M4 Pro with 24 gigs of memory. That's kind of the sweet spot before you then kind of dig up into the Studio. So let's go Mac Studio. And the Mac Studio is loaded with features and has a much higher ceiling in the amount of performance that can be packed into it. Okay, so here's, and you can see that, oh yeah, that's one thing else I wanted to point out. You can see the sales are not that great on the Mac Minis. Like $70 off, $50 off, $29 off. Like the sales are not good. But then if you get into a Mac Studio, you can get the M2 Ultra, and it gives you about $200 off. So that's where like the savings this year, especially on Apple products, is pretty kind of ebbs and flows. Over the next couple days, the algorithms are going to be, putting different things on sale. And so keep an eye on the model that you want based on the conversation that's taken place in the feed and what we've talked about throughout this video. And then keep an eye on it, check it maybe in the morning, at lunch, and then in the evening, and then strike while the iron's hot. Find the deal for the device that you need, not just being swept away with what device is on sale, even though it doesn't make sense to you. And that's my goal with this video, is finding the sale that you need. You're going to see more than ever this year that the sales are really led by algorithms. And that's really where you have to be careful of striking too fast and then realizing, oh gosh, yeah, that was a good sale, but it wasn't the right device for me. And I overspent because I got too excited. I definitely want to answer a few questions. This has definitely been my slowest attendance live stream. I figured that Apple people are overall not Apple people, but just there's not a lot of great sales on the Apple stuff this year. So it wasn't going to be as exciting of a live stream, but that was my conviction behind making this, is you can find the right deal for you. It just really has to be based on thoughtfulness on the end of what are you going to be using this device for. All right, I'm going to wrap up. We haven't had many questions. I'm okay with that. I really hope this video brings at least 5 to 10 people value during the Black Friday shopping season. Thank you so much for attending it. And remember that there are links in the description below. If I've been helpful throughout this video and you want to make a purchase, definitely head down there, grab those links, and that keeps the channel alive and the helpful content coming your way. Otherwise, I will see you all on a future live stream as we're covering more Black Friday sales.